Item 2, approval of the September 8 TMC meeting summary. Do I have a motion to approve as submitted?
So moved, Mr. Chairman.
Is there a second?
Second.
Any discussion about that? All right, I'll call for the question. All in favor signify by saying aye.
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 Opposed? Motion carries unanimously. We'll move to item 3, which is the RTA revenue forecast update. So it's an informational item. Is that correct?
That's correct, Mr. Chair. This is substantially what the RTA board saw at its last meeting. So I'll go through this pretty quickly. One thing I do want to update you on is that we are going to reference or show our most recent deposit, which we received last week. The RTA has a process of doing updated forecasts basically every 3 years. We've begun doing that after we began to come out of the Great Recession. Our initial forecast was done in 2006. These are dollars shown, nominal dollars, so they include inflation within them. Our 2006 nominal dollar forecast was then deflated down to $2006, and that was the basis of the RTA plan. But these are the nominal dollars, and for the purposes of this conversation, we'll be dealing with mostly nominal dollars. This graph shows a comparison of our forecasts as we've done them over time. As you can see, the orange bar, which represents the original RTA forecast, is quite a bit different from what we've actually been seeing, which is the blue bar to the left of the forecast, and then to the right of the forecast, each succeeding bar is an update. First done in 2013, followed by a 2017 update, 2019 update. We're about to present the 2021 update, which is not reflected on this graph. Before we do that, I do want to acknowledge that we've had very strong revenues recently. We are ahead of budget by 10.7% year-over-year growth through the most recent deposit that we received this month. That represents 5 of the 12 months of the year. You will note that the most recent deposit has a relatively small year-over-year growth. Don't be alarmed by that. There was an adjustment that was made to our commercial property tax TPT, which amounted to about $400,000 of a reduction, which we had seen in the month prior. So the months prior and it together have probably, if we were to average it, we'd be somewhere in the 5 to 6% growth rate year over year for those last 2 months.
Jim?
Yes.
Commercial property tax, TPT?
Yes.
Is that I thought this is just sales tax.
Well, we receive taxes from a number of different areas, which would include commercial leases. So if you were to lease an automobile, we would receive TPT on that. We receive it on even aviation fuel and things like that. There's about 14 or 15 different categories.
And they're in that category of commercial property.
Correct. Okay. Commercial leases.
Just seems so. Right. Correct. That's what when you say property, right. It's a TPT on certain.
Right. And one of the things that may make this a little interesting is the fact that not everybody collects all the same things. And I can tell you that the town of Laurel Valley does not collect a commercial real estate TPT. So.
Got it. So it's the real property rental tax, basically.
Correct. Okay. Correct. There's also, and that's for commercial only. We could tax residential, but nobody in the region has done that. The model tax code allows for that, though, but that has not been exercised. Okay. So moving on, we have done an updated estimate. We look at the estimate going out 30 years, looks at the likely changes in the tax base and how it affects revenue. We use the Eller Economic and Business Research Center. They in turn use the IHS Market products, which is a national forecasting tool, as well as local and statewide information that they develop themselves in the forecasting project, which is a statewide look at the economy that's shared throughout the state. They look at the Phoenix Mesa metro area, then Tucson metro area, and they look at statewide. This is a product that's a subset of that we asked them to look more intently at our particular forecast. We do it with 3 different outlooks. One is an optimistic, which basically trying to come up with a bracket of what we might expect with a baseline forecast being what we typically use. The baseline optimistic and pessimistic forecasts use different assumptions, one of which is inflation. So we'll talk about that in a moment. And all of the estimates acknowledge the impact of the pandemic, as being short-term. We expect a return to prior trends after the impact of the pandemic and its associated stimulus package. Okay, in terms of our tax base, this is the amount of taxable sales that we have within the region. We have seen a market increase as a result or following the pandemic, and looks pretty favorable when you look at it in this expression of nominal dollars. And it's certainly markedly improved since 2014 when we bottomed out following the Great Recession. However, that's not the full story. If you look at it on an inflation-adjusted estimate, our tax base, the total amount of sales, taxable sales within the region, is about where we were at the onset of the Great Recession now. It's taken us this long to recover from the Great Recession. And those are dollars that are lost, and that's part of the reason that we're struggling with filling the gap in construction costs. We saw, basically a 26% drop in our inflation-adjusted revenues immediately following the Great Recession. That's, again, still not all of the story here. When we look at it in terms of per capita tax base, the amount of taxable dollar, or the amount of sales that are taxable on a per capita basis, that's still well below what we were in just prior to the recession. I will note that this does not capture the most recent year, so you will see an uptick, but it still doesn't get us back up to the level we were prior to the Great Recession. So there's a substantial gap. In terms of what's happening with us, when we look at personal income and how much of that is in the tax base, how much of that is used to consume taxable items, that's been declining. We've been seeing, it's a long-term shift, but it really precipitously dropped during the Great Recession as people began to adjust their shopping or adjust their uses of their personal income. We've seen a greater shift from purchasing goods to purchasing services. A lot of that is due to healthcare, and it is part of a long-term nationwide trend. And as you can see, this is the forecast nationwide on that shift. As we as Americans our average age is getting older, we're consuming less in terms of goods, we're consuming more in terms of non-taxable services such as healthcare. And again, that is going to continue. We do see a little spike associated with the pandemic, but that will wane. This looks at Pima County's income growth. Again, the shaded bands are the recession periods. You can see that the Great Recession, we saw negative growth. It was the only year previously that we've seen negative growth in nominal disposable income. That we expect to see again next year, as again the impacts of the pandemic-related stimulus wane. So as we look at our forecast, again, this is in nominal dollars, year of collection dollars, we expect to see growth over the next 30 years from what we collected last year of $99.7 million to about $246 million per year in fiscal 21, or I'm sorry, fiscal 51, 30 years out. converting that or looking at the growth in nominal dollars, you can see a big spike in fiscal 21, and then followed by the decline that's associated with the decline in personal income, and then normalizing around 3% annually on an ongoing basis forward to that. Taking this and adding a negative and a pessimistic, or a pessimistic and an optimistic forecast, you can see the comparison of the different forecasts. And as I noted at the outset, the underlying assumptions include that of inflation, and that is why you see in the pessimistic forecast, the actual number of dollars collected in the out years goes up over the baseline. That's because of increased inflation. If we take that, I'm sorry.
This one shows the same thing. It shows a little drop in 23, 24 timeframe. Have they provided justification why they show that little negative blip?
Yeah, the negative blip is associated with the waning impacts of federal stimulus. So that's really the reason that they're showing it dropping off. As we stop the continuing effects of that pandemic related stimulus, we think the economy will slow down a little bit, but then it'll resume on a positive trajectory.
Okay, thank you.
This takes that revenue estimate and takes the inflation out. So this puts this or compares this to 2022 dollars. So you can see that we have that big bump in 21, and then we see a slight decline and then a growth going forward. Again, this is in fiscal 22 dollars, not in nominal dollars. So if you look at our revenue estimates, you'll see that it never goes negative. It's just that inflation has occurred, and we don't see much growth in it. So this is just wanted to share this with you. It's a valuable tool for us. It does show that we have a better forecast than we had in our 2019 estimate. It adds about $60 million to that estimate. So over the life of the RTA, we expect now to collect $1.68 billion from the beginning of collection in 2006 through the end of the RTA collection period on June 30, 2026. This is something that is a tool that not only useful to us in terms of the short-term outlook as we look to close out or finish the projects in the current plan, but it's a useful tool for us when we start considering projects in the future. Should the RTA be extended, this gives us some guidance in terms of what we might expect to receive. We're right now saying on the baseline that if the RTA plan were to be continued for 20 years, depending on what year that continuation occurs, if there's an overlap or no overlap, it'll range between $2 and $2.3 billion of additional revenue to the region in 2022 dollars. And with that, I know I've droned on a bit. Death by graphs. I apologize for that, but it's a pretty useful tool to explain things this way.
Very good, Jim. Questions from the group?
I just want to comment that this is very useful, and I think helps us kind of wrap our minds around what is the reality of tomorrow. I certainly hope that we're going with more of a pessimistic. I mean, at this juncture, gosh, I'd hate to, better to under promise and over deliver than the other way around. We've already been down that path, and it's not fun. So, I certainly would encourage PEG RTA to continue to be very conservative in our projections and in our commitments for dollars for the future.
Thank you. Other comments or questions? Comments or questions? I think you'll cover it in item 4, but just how that projection potential increase covers projects. So we'll defer. No other questions on this item. There is no action on this item. We'll move to item 4, which is cost to complete RTA projects, mandates and requirements. So who's covering that?
That would be me as well.
Thank you. All right, Mr. DeGree.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Wanted to first start out by giving an overview of how funds are distributed through the roadway element. I know there's been some conversation about, who's getting what percentage of it. This is just this is the 2006 dollars as they are allocated by jurisdiction, and shows a jurisdictional breakdown. You'll note that the city of South Tucson is not included in this as they have no roadway element projects within them. We do have an obligation to South Tucson of providing them at least 1% of our revenues per the state statutes. This next graph shows basically the value of the checks we've written through the end of fiscal 2020. I probably updated to 2021 now, but this is a product that we had done previously. Shows the checks written to the jurisdictions in their amount, $757 million in checks going out to the jurisdictions. They do not include checks to ADOT for work on our I-10 projects. They do not include bond debt service. They do not include projects that we've directly contracted for at the RTA. So we did a limited amount of project design and construction, primarily on 2 projects, the bus pullout program, which we pretty much administered and delivered those projects through bids we issued, as well as the design work on the RTA 24 second phase project at Golden Valencia, which was then constructed by the city of Tucson at that point in time. Those project costs go to the city, but the design of the project was RTA. We don't include funds directly spent on election expenses, legal or financial or audit planning and administrative expenses, all of which are very modest. We're limited to, on the administrative and planning side, to the 1% cap per statute. Moving on, as you know, we recently approved the 5-year TIP. The 5-year TIP fully funds to the ballot amount of the remaining roadway element projects. With one exception, it's the Grant and Grant Road Railroad Underpass, which is currently estimated to cost substantially less than what was in the ballot, in part due to creative changes that we appreciate that were done by the city of Tucson to try to find an alternative to physically removing the Union Pacific bridge there, which would have driven it over the cost. So that's the only project that is not fully funded to the ballot amount, and it still is expected to come in less than what we've got programmed. Due to the Great Recession back in 2014, the RTA board directed us to put all federal and state discretionary regional funds to the delivery of the RTA, and particularly the named projects, which are in the roadway element. When we compare our anticipated costs, now this is a first blush cost estimate that we did, we came up with, after we look at the most recent forecast and compare it to our most recent revenue or cost estimates, we are estimating a gap in funding of somewhere between $88 million and $131 million needed of additional funding. We acknowledge that costs have increased. They're above what they were when we established the 2006 ballot amounts. Those were in 2006 dollars. We acknowledge that there are some unforeseen costs that have impacted this, most especially archaeological right-of-way and railroad. costs that weren't contemplated. And there are some current estimates that include some expanded scopes, including on Sunset, Houghton Road, and Silver Bell. Those projects have additional lane capacity that was not scoped out in the original plan. So, we did apply the most recent forecast to this. That's why we're looking at $188 to $131 million. Mr. Modini, our executive director, sent out a memo, which you have a copy of in your packet, that amended what we had presented to the board back in September. We recognize that there are impacts that have been to the non-RTA revenue as well. Local impact fees are down, or were down, and we probably won't realize all of the local impact fees that were pledged to the RTA projects. We also know that HERF and local general funds were also impacted by the Great Recession, as well as the most recent pandemic. Although we're seeing some recovery in the HERF there, we haven't estimated that yet. So that's still money that once we do our updated estimates on it in conjunction with the next tip cycle, we'll look at that in greater detail. One thing we want to recognize is that the jurisdictions are responsible to provide additional funds or identify the funding sources that are needed to deliver the project, and we will be able to deliver or provide at the board's discretion additional funds based upon the revenue increases that we see. We do have to also keep in mind that scope related cost escalations are dealt with in parts of the administrative code that delegate that to the RTA board member, the lead agency that asks for the initial scope enhancements. So potential additional sources of funding, obviously there's the lead agencies can bring in additional resources. We have identified that the RTA revenues are more robust than we had previously forecast, so those monies will be available. Additional federal and state dollars may be available as well. We know we haven't fully digested the impact of the IIRA bill. That's the right acronym. The federal infrastructure bill. We know that there's a formulaic increase that not enormous, but there are other opportunities to look at project-related dollars that we need to explore. Federal, state, and those additional project-related proposals, the grants that come in there, we need to look at. I know that the town of Marana was very successful in going to the state and getting additional money directly from the state to augment the Tangerine Road project. And then in the cases where we are looking at an expansion of scope, perhaps that's something that could be incorporated into RTA next funding. But that's a decision for the board and for the CAC. So next steps, one of the things we'd like to do is we'd like to bring back the project review task force to look at projects. We found them to be very useful in confirming projects like the Downtown Links project were compliant with scope. There weren't scope increases. They looked at it, went into great detail, said, yeah, we think these, we encourage you to work through value engineering, but the scope is compliant. We are asking that the jurisdictional partners also come forward with their suggestions. We've got a couple of them that we'll follow in a moment. I know that the county has submitted a letter asking for a project change, as has the city, both in both First Avenue. And we need to make sure that we're looking very carefully at what are eligible expenses, what are not eligible expenses, and where they're not eligible, work with the jurisdictions to find the appropriate source of funding to do this. Finally, it's our recommendation that the RTA board look at our revenues on an annual basis, what the projects are that are in the pipeline, what they're needing. Our revenues will change, as will our costs. So we feel it's best to look at it as we are with this the most recent NOFA, to look at it incrementally as these projects ripen and become ready for construction. Look at what we can bring to bear in terms of. So that, Mr. Chair, is the bulk of my presentation. I'd be happy to answer any questions you may have. And I know that we have another item following here to look at the first few recommendations.
Thank you, Jim. Can you go back? I think it's 3 slides.
Okay.
To
Okay.
So I would caution the language of funding requests versus cost to deliver. There's a nuance there when we talk about funding requests above the ballot amount. Not necessarily a request, it's the cost of delivering the program. I think that we have to be careful because it implies that there's just a request for dollars above the ballot amount. And I don't think that's the case. It's a function of the delivery of the program, dollars necessary for that. So I would caution you on that language. And that might be a nuance, right? That might be first. I think it's important as we talk about the program. What is the cost of delivery? Second thing is when you talk about on that first bullet point, so the funding need to deliver the program is between 88 and 130. I assume that that's compared to the cost of delivering the program, or is that in comparison to the?
Mr. Chair, that is looking at the cost estimates that we had done earlier this year. They largely involve using the RMAP products that we had, then comparing it against the what was in the ballot identified and is currently unexpended, and then the new revenues based upon the most current forecast that were not in the tip that we adopted in May. So yeah, that's what we see the gap as being. And one thing one thing I do want to stress is that this is a range. It's not an absolute. In fact, one of the things we've had a very productive conversation with DTM staff on has been looking at, can we get our cost estimates in alignment, because we don't need to be putting out dueling numbers. What we want to be is we want to find a consensus opinion of what it will cost to deliver the remaining projects and move forward to try to meet the needs. So that's an effort that's ongoing. We weren't prepared to put it into this presentation, but it is something that we will be bringing forward to.
Can I follow on with
Please.
the question that you have? Since I admittedly have never read the ballot language of the 2005 or whatever, can you give me an example of the interpretation of, just kind of tailing on to what the chairman said, what you're considering additional programmatic requests versus, because I don't know how vague or how specific the language was in the ballot about a particular project, okay, the widening of XYZ road to 4 lanes, whatever, or to 6 lanes. And I know one of the requests is, we don't need 6 lanes, we go down to 4 lanes, so that's actually a shrinking of the project, but simply a reallocation of what explain to me, what is that specific ballot language that you feel gives you what are the bumpers we need to be working within, and where is there some, let's call it interpretation opportunities for delivering, as Mike said, the project, which is increase the capacity of the roadway. Because a lot of things change and have changed over 15 years. Reading the memo from the city of Tucson, I certainly can see it's like, yeah, our traffic projections aren't as what we thought they were going to be. And so why overbuild, right? Which I think is wise. We don't want to overbuild something, but we want to improve it. So for me, my education, and I apologize if everybody's already up to speed on that, but
No, it's a very, very good question.
Mr. Chair, Ms. Jacobs, I'll try not to go overboard on this response because I
no, I
can talk
appreciate
for days about this, but
please don't, Jim.
I'll try
Open the
to,
can.
within my capacity, I'll be succinct. But there have been a number of things. I mean, we talked about what happened with revenues. One of the big drivers on why our revenues are not what we saw, certainly the ravages of the Great Recession,
Sure.
but part of it also with we've seen some fundamental shifts in our community and how we're growing. And so we're not 1.2 million people in this region today. We're closer to less than 1. So, we never saw the growth. And right now, if you look at the approved demographic estimates, we're not going to see the kind of growth that we were originally forecasting at the time the RTA plan was developed. So that's an influence in terms of, what we put into the plan, what we scoped. Now, that said, we didn't have a perfect crystal ball as to where growth was going to occur, nor will we ever. This is something that is going to be changing. So needs are different in different parts of the community. We may see more demand in an area that's growing in a fashion that we couldn't predict in 2006. That may require some increases, whereas that growth that isn't realized or has transferred to other parts of the community that we're planning on may leave us with a lack of need for growth facilities. And then we have the whole fundamental issue of are we changing in the way we commute? I can tell you I certainly have over the last year, and so these all have impacts, and will they be sustained? I think we have to make our best estimates and make decisions that'll be as resilient as we can make. So that at the outset, I hope I have answered part of that. Now, your question
That was
about
foundational. Okay.
foundational. So now going into more specific detail within the RTA plan, and we publish every year. We publish our mobility document, and in the our mobility document, we list what the project is and what it was going to contain. And that is the very same language that was on the ballot materials, ballot supplemental materials that went out, the newsprint thing that went out to every household in Pima County that had voters. That language is identical. That is our promise. And that is what we're measuring our projects against in terms of whether or not they'd be on scope or a less than scope. So that's the guidance. In 2006, immediately following the vote, the RTA board also adopted an administrative code, which went into a little more detail. In some cases, it added some conflicts, but for the most part, it helped us better understand what the intent was of those projects at the time. And that ties back to the cost estimates that were done in support of setting the dollar.
The administrative code was approved by the board, not the voters,
Correct.
which means it can be amended by the board.
Correct.
Okay, just
Correct.
checking.
And the board has the authority to amend projects,
Right.
even if they chose. I mean, they have that authority. It's vested in them. However, in 2005, prior to the vote being set, the board also took a pledge, and that was to not reduce functionality. So that's, again, they can, that's for them to interpret. Functionality is a word of art, not great definition. You can interpret it how you want.
Drive a
wish.
truck through it.
Yeah, absolutely. So, but I think, but it does set a bar for us to look at
Sure.
and measure against. So that is what we're measuring against. Anything that is beyond what was written in there is something that we would consider to be an optional item that we would ask to identify additional funds for.
Is there an assumption in the language of each one? I'm just gonna throw this out, you know, that if the word drainage wasn't included, that we can't address drainage in a road improvement project, or, you know what I mean? Like, there's some
Well,
basic.
I can go a little further on that too.
things.
So let me attempt to add to the response
Okay.
first, and then I'll come back to that question. So if I understood your question correctly, where there was very specific language was on 35 projects. Those 35 projects were named from point A to point B, and here's the scope of the project, very specifically outlined. And then there was a cost associated with each project. So that's where we have a very specific focus on those 35. If you recall, we've done over 900 projects. So those other projects are where we have flexibility, and those are all consistent with the ballot. They're consistent with the code. Those 35, those are corridor projects, a lot more specific, and the cost is tied to the scope, and that's where we end up being very careful to make sure we're following the statutes and we're following what's in the code, as well as board's wishes to make adjustments. So that's where we're at with most of our projects. To date, we've only made a few minor adjustments. We haven't made any significant adjustments. But where really a question comes in is how much flexibility we have to go above and beyond that expenditure authority. And that's up to the board. The board can make that decision,
Okay,
as long as they're consistent with the statutes.
okay, thank you. That helps. I appreciate that.
So let me go down the rabbit hole just a tiny bit. So I hear everything you said, and I don't really disagree with what you outlined. But at the last, right before Farhad jumped in, you said anything that's above that scope, we look for other funding or something. There's a piece here that I think is important, and that's that the delivery of the project is different today than it was in 06. There were assumptions made in 06 on how projects are delivered. And quite frankly, the public participation, the public involvement and engagement was not necessarily a huge thought in 06 like it is today. Today, it's almost 180 degrees from what it was in 06. That's just a reality that we live in. Okay. So as we go down this path, the only way to deliver a program that will ultimately resonate with the voter for an opportunity to have a conversation about an extension or RTA next or whatever, right, is to make sure that we are not violating the expectation of the voter. And I'm not talking about just the ballot language, I'm talking about the process for delivery of the program, that project, whatever that is. So, and one of the pieces that I've looked at is the downtown links, right? Downtown links was extremely complex from a lot of different perspectives, which is just the engineering and the construction. But then you add on top of that neighborhoods and public participation and all those other pieces. Then my point and my thought is we couldn't deliver that program, that project, were it not for that engagement with the public and that engagement and all of the public participation costs that were added to that project. And when I get nervous is when it says, you know, jurisdictions are responsible to provide local funds. Great. So what happens if a jurisdiction goes through that process in order to get, we'll call it approval, delivery of that project, and then there's $10 million, just pick a number, that's allocated as, no, that's above the scope, through 06, the jurisdiction doesn't have the dollars to deliver it. Now what? Well, you're bad partners because you said you were going to way back when, right? Well, I've got news for you. That's a reflection on us as a region and our ability to deliver that program. So that's where I think the rub is when we keep talking about the ballot amount, it's great. I mean, I'm good with that. I understand it. That's not necessarily going to deliver the program. In order for us to use the program as the example of, hey, look, our ability as a region to deliver on what we said is solid, and here are examples. That's the fundamental concern that I have. And this is not a new thing. I've said this 6 years ago when we started these discussions. But now we're really getting down to the brass tacks because we have projects that are on the horizon that we know we don't have enough money for. So I put that back, and I understand the board can approve and not approve, and hey, that's great. I don't have an issue with that. Ultimately, though, it's the delivery of the program. And I'm glad to hear that you guys are working together with some of the staff to identify and hone in on those costs. But when I see a column that says this isn't eligible, what incentive does an agency have to pad project elements or costs? None, zero, other than delivery. And so I keep coming back to that fundamental relationship that we need to have with the voter, with the resident, with the public, in order to be able to point back and say, hey, we're good. If we weren't talking about an RTA next or an opportunity for future funding from the public, then I'd say, let's get out there and get it done. We just, all the money we have, we're done. But we are in the business of developing and nurturing that relationship with voters so that they see that we bring value to the game. So that's the rest of the story for me, and that's why I get nervous about this, because I think that it categorizes in a way that doesn't necessarily convey confidence that we can deliver the program. Always, not just me or you or anyone. So that's just some food for thought as to why some of the language makes me nervous. And again, we're at the table. We want to solve the problem. We want to solve the issue. We all know the recession. We see what the graphs say and all that. But there is a fundamental reality on how we're going to deliver the program.
I may add to that, actually.
Well,
I'm sorry.
Bill,
I'm sorry, go ahead. I didn't see you over
I'm going to add to it too, so you can add when I'm done, Mr. Chair. I totally agree with you. And when this plan was put together decades ago, we were building engineering projects. We were building curbs, we were building asphalt, we were building sidewalks, some drainage structures, and that's what the plan included. This issue is much more of a concern of the city of Tucson, partly because you have a considerably more robust public participation project, but also because you're the only one that's really dealing with inner city problems. We want to widen Sandario Road. There's not a lot of people going to care. You want to widen something and take down businesses and remove houses. There's a lot that's going to have to go into that. And so I think your point is really well taken, not as it relates to this project, but as it relates to next. There needs to be something that's put into these projects that maybe even be looked at as an opportunity, that as the project moves forward, that there's a fund in there that the community, the neighbors can have to be able to do some beautification, to be able to build some things along the roadway, public art. It's not necessarily exactly what I'm talking about, but in order to help sell the project, because as I say, if it's out in the middle of nowhere, nobody cares. But some of the projects that really need to get done have major impacts on a segment of the community. And if there's something put in there as an incentive to allow the project to go through, I think we need to learn from where we've been.
So the only thing I would suggest is absolutely in the RTA next and that approach. But in order to get to that point, you've got to solve this.
Absolutely.
And we have to solve it in a way that will resonate with the resident voter. When we didn't include odds.
Yeah.
So that's the struggle that I have is how do we convey this with resonates with the voter?
I was just going to add that Ms. Jacobs touched on it as well earlier. So it really goes back to that cost estimating exercise and being able to have a more hopefully robust cost estimating, and then create those additional capacity within the cost estimate to do that, which kind of goes back to what you just
Yeah.
said. So definitely for the RTA next, that's an opportunity. We need to do that. With the current plan, again, goes back to your question. There is some flexibility within the language, but it's really restricted. So we need to manage it within what we're allowed to do.
Mr. Chairman, thank you, Mr. McGee. I hear you, and I am now more, what I'm hearing is, yeah, there are 35 projects that had a lot more detailed information that maybe in hindsight, we should have been quite so detailed, okay? So but we do have to live within it. However, what I'm also hearing is that ultimately it's up to the board. And I think that we also need to determine what is the risk, you know, truly, what is the risk? And that's up to us as the TMC to say to, you know, to the, what is the risk if we do versus what is the risk if we don't? Okay, there's a risk on both sides, for sure. I very much appreciate the fact that you as our administrators are giving us the wise counsel about these are the bumpers, you know, it's our job to inform you about what those are. And that's your job, and that's what we expect you to do. We all recognize that there is a finite amount of money between now and the end of the 2026. We've got some things on the table, and we've got some things. I think we need to come to a conclusion as to what can we between now and the end ensure that we pay for, and what do we want to accomplish right between now and the end. And then how do we get there? How much is going to come from RTA? Where do we come with these other? And I agree with you. I think some of the infrastructure funding, since it's going to be funneled through the state, you know, we may have some opportunities to do that over the next, but that we all know that ain't happening for another year or two before we start getting that money trickling down. But that could be enough that we need to sort of, you know, sprinkle in for those last ones and get us up to the full cup that we need to construct them. But I, you know, I think, and I hear what Mr. Ortega is saying. Let's get the project done. Let's build that credibility, and let's figure out whatever that looks like. And if it means we got to drop something off at the end, or that's a maybe at the end, versus, you know, getting something moving that is one of the 35 that we can get done that we promised the voters. That's a credibility, and we got to set ourselves up. We're all thinking about RTA next, and we're all looking at, you know, that number that you projected. We got $2 billion over the next couple of decades to continue to invest in our community and transportation. That's just with the half cent. You know, and that's great. That's good numbers for us. And I realize that we're not talking about RTA next at this point. But I do think we need to be as creative as we can to look to, here's where we want to be. Here's what we want to get accomplished. This is the right thing now, regardless of what we promised in the 2-decade-old plan that was developed with the best information that everybody had at that time. I mean, they did a good job, right? But let's figure out how we can get there and get it done. And that means everything's on the table.
Go back to the second slide.
This one or this one?
So one of the things that you may want to consider in the presentation of this, I think that you mentioned this is the chemistry of the 2006 ballot.
This is actually, Mr. Chair, this is a look at where the monies are being expended for the various roadway element projects. It's not the whole plan.
So it's current though?
This is current
According to the
boundaries.
ballot amount. This is
Ballot
according to-
amount?
Yeah.
Ballot amount and jurisdictions as they exist today.
I'm not sure I understand.
2006 program, roadway elements only were distributed according to this
Okay,
Pie
that's
chart.
what I understood.
Yes.
So what I would suggest for the future is to have this as an ongoing pie chart on action. But on an actual expenditure. Because then that.
So that's the next slide.
Go to the next slide, but I don't remember seeing percentages on that.
Yeah,
Maybe
there aren't percentages,
Yeah.
but they're dollar amounts.
To have apples and apples. Okay. So that's just a suggestion on that in terms of presentation. And go to the last slide.
Oops, not that last slide.
So I would suggest that it says the RTA board will annually evaluate the revenue determined if additional funds are provided. I mean, that happens anyway, right? I mean, that's the budget process, right? And I know that during the course of the year, when we have these meetings, we give updates on projects and kind of where we are, kind of a snapshot. I would suggest that those conversations need to happen more often than annually. And I think it needs to be a more robust, ongoing discussion about the issues that we're facing, the potential impact for delivery. Not necessarily to affect budget, but for knowledge for everybody that's going on. And you already sort of do that. I mean, you get updates and that. But I think if you hone in on the nuggets where, from a program delivery standpoint, we may be struggling, that's a conversation I think that could be had, quarterly, some more frequent conversation than that.
Sure, we'd be happy to. If you don't mind, go back to the previous slide too. I want to go back to what Ms. Jacobs was just discussing as far as options. So RTA Next was one of our options, and we've been talking about RTA Next. One of the reasons we started the process in 2018 was to create more of an overlap between the current plan and the future plan. So there was an opportunity to address some of these issues with the next plan. That overlap now is getting smaller and smaller. And potentially, regardless of what we do, we hope that the overlap would be at a minimum 2 years, maybe even 3 years. And if it's a 3-year overlap, that's where there's an opportunity to address some of these issues with RTA Next. So it is part of the conversation.
Good, thanks.
Other questions from the group?
Mr. Chairman?
Oh, go ahead. Sure.
Yes, John Bernal.
Yes, sir.
I just have one observation, and we're talking about, the confidence of the voters and what they rely on when they cast a vote for something like this. I think our concentration, as I think have talked around it, is that we make sure we hit all 35 of those original projects in the RTA program, unless, and I'm not talking about keeping exactly within the same scope, but make sure all 35 are addressed in some fashion, because otherwise we will be accused of being disingenuous in presenting a program that we were going to deliver and didn't. So, I mean, scope changes are fine if, the populace has come around to a different point of view, but not hitting all 35. And the example I'm thinking about, in the 97 bond program that Pima County had, we had numerous roadway projects, but one project in particular, in the Catalina area, the residents just didn't want it, period. So the board said, fine, you don't get that project, but every other project was delivered. That's my comment. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Great wisdom there. Other thoughts or comments from anyone? Comments on this topic? Okay, hearing none, that was not an action item, again, informational. Let's move on to item 5, which is responses to requests for input on remaining RTA projects. Is that again you, Mr. DeGrood?
Yes, Mr. Chair.
All right, get on it.
Anyway, I just wanted to remind you all that at our last RTA TMC meeting, the chair suggested the jurisdictions delivering the remaining projects offer some suggestions, and how we might look at perhaps delivering the projects without diminishing functionality, and doing so with at least closer to the budget or the funding available is probably the best way to determine that. And we went ahead and sent a letter out to all of the jurisdiction TMC members, asking them to identify those opportunities. And I sent a follow-up memo, which noted that some projects were being designed with scopes that were greater than that were identified in the RTA plan, and asked for the jurisdictions to confirm their commitment to fund those scope enhancements. We did receive 2 formal responses from one each from the city and the county. A number of other additional projects have been identified as having potential cost reductions through scope changes, and we're having some further discussion with them. They're very informal. We're not prepared to present them at this point in time, but we think they may merit a deeper look, and they are all period 4 projects, so we have the time to do that. Conversely, several projects have been identified with significant expansions desired per our statutes, and project expansions are permissible as long as the lead agency requesting the change is able to identify funding for the incremental cost of the expansion. We have 2 projects where we have seen scope reductions requested by jurisdictions. The first is First Avenue, Orange Grove to Ina, which has been suggested by the county that we eliminate that project. They have found that the traffic growth is not occurring as was originally anticipated, and the current traffic is handled adequately by the current roadway prism. I would add that the county a number of years ago went through a process where they de-emphasized that portion of First Avenue in their major streets and routes plan. We actually sent a letter opposing it, noting that it was in the RTA plan for development. It went forward. Anyway, we also have a request from the city of Tucson to consider reducing the width of First Avenue between Grant and River from the planned or the scoped 6-lane program to a 4-lane program with enhanced safety features. We, coupled with the county's request to eliminate the First Avenue project, they also suggested that the funds that were allocated to First Avenue between Orange Grove and Ina be redirected to increasing the scope of the Silver Bell Road project from El Camino del Cerro to Ina. That would be the final phase of that. In that particular phase of the project, we in the RTA plan calls it out as a 3-lane section. And the jurisdictions, we began having conversations with the original planning efforts where a 4-lane section was being preferred by all of the agencies involved. And this is a multi-jurisdictional project. It's got City of Tucson anchoring the south end, the county in the middle, and the town of Marana on the northern end. All 3 DOT directors said that they would work to identify funding for that at the time. We really haven't formalized anything in that. And I realize that we've had transitions and many of the DOT directors, in fact, I think all the DOT directors that suggested this approach have all transitioned in their careers and are no longer the current DOT directors of those organizations. So I guess I'm the only common participant in that discussion. So, Mr. Chair, that's those are the responses we've got. Our next step is to, first of all, we recognize that all scope and budget changes require the RTA board's approval. So it's ultimately their sole decision. But we're looking for TMC input and evaluation. We also welcome comments from county and city staff. I believe the city is prepared for a presentation on its recommended change of scope. And I understand that Ms. Olivares and Ms. Skinner are available to take questions on the county's request. So with that, Mr. Chair, that concludes my my presentation, and I'll turn it to I guess we could go first to Mr. Hartley, who's going to present on the city's request, assuming you have no questions for me.
But we can wait. Let's just go to the presentation and we'll come back.
Great. Thank you, Mr. DeGroote, for the introduction, and good morning to everyone. And thank you very much for the opportunity to present on the request from the city of Tucson to change the scope of the First Avenue project from River to Grant. So as I mentioned, we are in front of you asking today to request a scope change from the ballot identified 6-lane widening project to a 4-lane modernization. This request is supported by a 3-year needs assessment effort that we've gone through, which looked at the mobility needs on the corridor, updated cost estimates, looked at the changing travel patterns, travel conditions, as well as the underlying performance of the corridor in terms of mobility, pedestrian safety, bus ridership, the entire multimodal framework, and really developed this needs assessment under the concept of the Complete Streets program, which we continue to advance in the city of Tucson. Really central to this was that we also compared kind of the costs and benefits and updated cost estimates for 2 corridor alternatives, looking at a 4-lane modernization, which is what we are proposing today, and how it compares and contrasts against a 6-lane expansion. We'll say that this was developed in partnership with the Kittleson team, so they are here, can also take additional questions. So thank you very much, Jim. So the area under question, as I mentioned, is looking at the entire 3-mile corridor from River Road to Grant Road, currently a 4-lane roadway with a 2-way left turn lane continuous throughout the extent. To the south, there is a continuation of the 4-lane roadway with 2-way left turn lane, and then north of River, we have a 4-lane divided roadway with a continuous median. So with the downscope and the modernization project does continue to offer the uniformity along the corridor, not creating an expansion within these 3 miles. The original project was scoped again for that 6-lane bike lane sidewalks as described on ballot item number 14. The cost estimate for the project was in $2,006, as we've been discussing all morning, coming in at about $75 million was the estimate at that time to deliver this project. So in anticipation of going into kind of the planning design and the more detailed work, we wanted to conduct this needs assessment because we recognize that, yeah, we're operating in a financially constrained environment. And it has also been 15 years since the RTA plan was approved. A lot of our assumptions have changed within the city of Tucson, particularly as we've identified kind of these evolving needs. So the traffic demands, the volumes that were anticipated that the 2006 ballot was built on for this particular project have never materialized. I think we were looking at about 1.5 million residents in the county at that time for 2030. To hit that, we'd have to be seeing sustained 5% year-over-year annual population growth. So we are about 15-20% below what was anticipated for the traffic volumes on this corridor, which I'll get into a little bit. We've also seen the policy framework within the city has changed. So we recently, or about 2 years ago, passed our Complete Streets policy, in which we are identifying a kind of a broader range, more holistic concepts of what the needs are on our corridors, getting away from really kind of travel demand, traffic, driving our transportation decisions, to looking at these projects more comprehensively, trying to address a number of problems. In particular, on this corridor, we see a lot of challenges with providing the necessary kind of multimodal elements of the corridor, the facilities, as well as underperformance in terms of safety of First Avenue, and especially for pedestrians. Our cost estimates needed updating to see what the actual cost to construct would be in 2019 dollars as opposed to 2006 dollars, comparing those around those different alternatives. And the needs assessment really allowed us to look at opportunities to right-size the public investment. I think, as you had mentioned previously, that maybe we don't need a 6-lane facility if the traffic assumptions haven't materialized. So we can downscope these projects, still deliver the outcomes, and really decide on a project scope before getting into the more costly kind of planning, detailed design of the corridor to make that determination of the scope to advance it more quickly through that process. So as I mentioned, we were looking at both the 4-lane and 6-lane section. Even though the 4-lane would keep the same number of lanes as the current corridor, we would look at a full modernization, including access control through a center median, continuous sidewalks, landscaping, enhanced bike lanes. And the comparison of the two would be about 100 feet of right of way estimated versus 120 feet at the cross section. Again, this is at the very conceptual level, and we'll hash a lot of these out as we advance this project more into planning and design.
What's the current right of way there?
It varies from about 85 to 90 feet to about 120, 130 feet. It's a lot tighter on the southern extent as we get south of Roger and approach Grant. We've got a lot of right of way on the northern extent.
So regardless, acquisition of property would have been required one way or another.
Yeah, there will be far fewer with the narrower section. And I think it will also give us more opportunities to look at specific areas where we can, narrow it up if we have to eliminate some of the landscaping elements to save existing structures. It gives us a lot more flexibility to be able to do that because the width of that additional travel lane is kind of a fixed width. So some of the underlying needs we did identify is that this is an opportunity to replace the bridge over the Rito. It is a structure that was constructed originally in 1961 and is currently at 80% of its 75-year lifespan. The needs assessment estimated we have about 12 to 15 more years out of this structure. So probably we're not going to be coming into any other additional funding in that horizon. So this really does provide the opportunity for us to replace the bridge over first. It's also not accessible to pedestrians and has very minimal bicycle facilities. Again, keeping with our complete streets approach, these are elements that we would want to incorporate into any bridge updates. As I mentioned previously, one of the things that we're really looking at is really central to the improvements that we're trying to make on this project would be the safety performance. In terms of vehicular crashes, you see nearly as many, about 100 fewer on First as you see on Oracle, which has considerably higher traffic volumes than First. So the crash rate per BMT is going to be much higher than First. It's underperforming kind of its pure corridors. And almost double what you see on Campbell and Stone. Most striking, I think, as I did mention, were the pedestrian crashes, where you see during the study period, 53 on First Avenue versus 24, 16, and 30 on Stone and Campbell. So kind of operating in the same area of the city, but considerably a higher number of crashes. So again, we're putting that safety element front and center as we advance this project. We're kind of a comparable number of bicycle crashes across the board. I did look at these numbers prior to putting this presentation together. So these were developed through the needs assessment. Looking at the most recent data, these relationships have continued up until about the 2019 data sets. We also know that demand is there and we aren't providing the facilities that demand requires. So only about 64% of the corridor actually has continuous and accessible sidewalks currently. But there is high pedestrian activity, really stemming from the fact that this is a frequent transit route, one of our top 10 buses by ridership within the transit system. So we have a lot of that demand, as well as there's a lot of multifamily housing, libraries, commercial services along the corridor, particularly in the area of Prince and Fort Lowell, which you can see at the right of the screen, based on the actuations of the Hawks, is that we do see a lot of demand there. So we want to make sure that that's something that we're looking at. And as I mentioned, the pedestrian crashes are an ongoing concern. This segment, this stretch was actually identified in the city's pedestrian safety action plan as part of our pedestrian high injury network, meaning it is in the top 10% of segments of corridors with pedestrian crashes in the city of Tucson. The final thing we want to take a look at this morning would be the mobility question. So on the base year of this study, we're seeing about 28,000 vehicles per day. And we came up with two projections looking out to 2045 based on the PEG travel demand model from 2019. So instead of just hitting one kind of projection and saying that's our target and that's what we're going to build around, we recognize that these things are continuously in flux. The further out on the horizon we get, the less certainty there is. So we came up with this range of a high projection and a low traffic projection extracted from the travel demand model. So in the low traffic projection, we're looking at about a 16% increase in traffic forecasted from 28,000 vehicles per day average along the corridor. And you can see the ranges down here at the bottom for the different segments, up to about 38,000 vehicles per day, or ranging between about 16 to 36% growth. Did I lose my ability to advance the slide?
Nice.
It just advanced all the slides.
Just to the end. Yeah.
So looking back kind of at our historic traffic growth on this corridor, as I mentioned, the volumes never really materialized. So taking the raw traffic counts going back to 1998, we've actually seen about a 1 to 1.5% year-over-year decrease in traffic volumes over that period. It's fallen off more so following the recession. It was really peaking in 2006, which was driving the assumptions of this original scope of this project. So we wanted to take that and run a comparison between what the kind of mobility outputs or outcomes would be of the 6-lane modeled on the assumptions from 2006, which underlied the 2030 long-range regional transit plan, or the RMAP, versus what the 2019 model outputs are telling us, our more recent assumptions, comparing them against the high versus the low range. So comparing for the 2019 model year, which again is modeling up to 2045, compared to the 2006 model year, which is modeling up to 2030, so a 15-year longer horizon, we're estimating that we're seeing about an 11% average reduction in traffic volumes on the corridor forecasted 15 years later into the life of this project. So that is on the high scenario. And as I mentioned, the high scenario is still fairly aggressive because we've actually been seeing a decrease in volumes on this corridor for the last 25 years. And then it's about a 25% difference, again, 25% higher what the RTA estimated for 2006 versus what the 2019 model outputs are currently for 15 years later. Same relationship on the intersections. It's a difference of 7% and 17% of volumes through those intersections based on the base year versus future, so 2030, 2045. So ultimately what this results in is that the 4-lane option that we are proposing actually under both the high and the low scenario outperform in the peak hour at the intersection what the 6-lane option would have given us modeled under the 2006 assumptions 15 years farther into the future. Same is true of the segments. It's a fairly comparable. The low projection performs better than what the 2006 estimate had, and the high projection is about the same. So under our current projections, the 4-lane option with the modernization, with improvements to the intersections, shows that this corridor would operate at desirable performance under the low growth scenario well into the future to the 2045 horizon year. Under the high growth scenario, we do have one segment where we'd fall into level of service E at peak hour northbound, just under high, but it still delivers the functionality of the 2006 RTA build scenario 15 years beyond that planning horizon.
That's because everybody's driving to Oro Valley. Okay.
So we provided a side-by-side comparison. Some of this discussion is just an estimate of what some of the property impacts would be. The other thing is that within our current cost estimates, and these are 2019 dollars, so we have seen some cost escalation in that time, we can deliver the 4-lane to much closer to that listed ballot amount than we could deliver that 6-lane. Now, this isn't a fixed cost. This was the best estimate we had at the time. There may be some other considerations that come into this. There's some outstanding drainage issues that need to be addressed, but it's about a 20% cost difference between the two options that we could deliver this project for about 20% cheaper.
Wait, can we hang here for just a sec? I just want to take a look at so what you're saying is that, let me understand. If we did what the ballot said, we're required to do, we'd spend $91.7 million.
Correct.
If we do this project, we'll spend about what was estimated in the original ballot language, which was what, 71?
75, yeah, for the both contributions.
Okay, thank you.
Again, this is the 2019 dollars, so costs have continued to escalate in that time, but it is much closer to that ballot amount. Through this process, we also took the needs assessment public to see where the community stood on these two alternatives and the commitment to kind of, going for that 6-lane or seeing if we want to do the cost savings and impact reduction in the 4-lane. We spent about 3 months out in the community doing a quick survey and got about 1,100 respondents from that. We did it both, had an online presence. We did a lot of in-person work, did tabling, intercept surveys on the buses. And by about a 2-to-1 margin, survey respondents preferred the 4-lane modernization project for a variety of reasons, including less impacts to property, providing better multimodal options, maintaining neighborhood connectivity and crossing the roadway. A desire for less reliance on single occupancy vehicle trips. And this is a distribution of where we heard from survey responses. So as you can see, a lot of it is clustered along the extent of the corridor, but it does have a regional distribution. Interestingly, I did look at the top 5 zip codes that responded. 1 and 2 were on either side of First Avenue. Number 3 was up here in Catalina Foothills. All 5 of them had the same preference. None of the top 5 zip codes said that we prefer the 6-lane alternative. The closest was in the foothills here. It was like 53 to 47%, but in all cases, it did err towards the side of the narrower section. So we brought all this information to Tucson's mayor and council, who did approve the change in scope from the 6-lane to the 4-lane. So the city of Tucson is now seeking agreement from the recommendation from mayor and council from the RTA board. With that, you can take any
Thank you.
questions, but I would direct them to my bosses.
Any questions? Any questions on this request? Pretty thorough. I think the key, probably that second to last slide, the public participation in terms of making sure that it again resonates with the voter. That's the underlying here. Is someone on, Anna or Catherine, are you all on, or Carmine, is somebody going to make a presentation on the request from the county?
Good morning, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. This is Ana Olivares, Transportation Director for Pima County. We don't have a prepared presentation. I just wanted to go over the items we discussed in the letter that we sent to the RTA about our proposed elimination of this project. We have not done a need study or done any kind of spent any funding to do an evaluation of this First Avenue project from Ina Road to Orange Road. We are basing our recommendation based on the projected volume from PAG for 2045. As original ballot, this project called for a 4-lane arterial with bike lanes and sidewalks with a budget of $7.2 million approximately dollars. 6.6 of that would be RTA funding and 700,000 would be other. That doesn't mean that this is the cost of this project. This is what was in the ballot amount as approved. The current roadway segment is 3 lanes with paved shoulders and signalized intersections with dedicated turn lanes. Based on the projected traffic volume for 2045, this is adequate configuration to support that volume. And we feel no expansion is needed at this time. So that's why our recommendation is that this project be eliminated and not be worked on and use that money on projects where the scope has changed, the traffic projections have changed, and we need to modify the scope to meet the projections and redirect that funding to another project like Silverville. That is really the highlights. Catherine, feel free to add anything.
I don't have anything to add. Like Anna said, there's actually 4 lanes at the Orange Grove First Avenue intersection. So that intersection has been modernized, much like the First and Ina intersection has been expanded and modernized. So it's really just the segment in between those intersections that would need to be made 4-lane if we were going to meet the RTA code. But the volumes are only up to 11,000 vehicles per day in 2045, which is well within what a 2-lane facility can accommodate. So that is it. Thank you.
Very good. Any questions for the Pima County staff on their suggestion or requests?
I just have one comment. I completely agree with the request for the section from Orange Grove to Ina. I agree. I drive it frequently. One suggestion is that there maybe consider some pedestrian facilities on that section. There are folks that do walk out there, and they often walk in the roadway.
Very good.
Thank you.
Good suggestion.
County can pay for that itself, Anna. With all the infrastructure money you're gonna get.
Without dating myself too much, I can tell you that the intersection of Sunrise and First was one of the first projects that I worked on when I worked for John Bernal, who worked for Chuck at the time. So that just kind of puts things in perspective, full circle. So any other questions or comments?
And it was a job well done, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Bernal. I appreciate that. And it was the tremendous leadership we had at the time, right? Just lay it on thick. Other comments or questions for the staff? Go ahead.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman. I want to ask a couple of questions because I understand, of course, the staff's responsibility to bring to our attention the parameters of the ballot language. That's exactly what you should do. So let me ask you a question on the First Avenue segment from the city of Tucson. The ballot language, again, because I haven't seen what it is, specifically called out 6 lanes, specifically mentioned bike lanes or some
Bike lanes,
bike lanes,
yes.
sidewalks, that kind of thing. Okay. So, and of course, technology has changed and, were there, what about the bridge? I recognize that the replacement of the Rito is a pretty big expense. And as we're talking about funding, did it either say or not say anything about the bridge?
The replacement of the bridge would have been part of the scope
Okay,
of the
okay.
6-lane project, and that was part of the cost as well.
Okay, all right. So that's not new or different. It's just a smaller scope at this point in terms of the proposal. Okay. So one thing I just want to mention before I talk about, and I'm sure you all have thought about, the infrastructure bill does give us some opportunities for sure for additional funding. For example, they specifically call out bridges. If we can bring money in from the infrastructure bill, because God knows this is going to take years to complete, to supplement and say, hey, that's where we're going to put that money to free up. We can piecemeal this like a little puzzle, as we always do, right? We got impact fees, we got this, maybe safety money. PEG gets some safety money. If this is one of those really, really clearly top 10 concerns, I think that, that sort of piecemealing the puzzle piece of all of the different revenues. Here's my personal perspective. I think our residents expect us to make wise investments. That's our job as public officials. And when the data shows that just because we said we would need this 15 or 20 years ago, we should therefore build it. But clearly we're all like, including the Pima County request as an example, but we really don't need it. I am not an advocate in our role as trusted public officials to spend money just because we can, but because we should. And I have to say that I appreciate the extra time that the city of Tucson took on this one project to really dig in. And in the end, it's cheaper. Now, we're still short dollars and all that kind of stuff in terms of our overall collections. But I don't think that is a risk, or if it is a risk, and I suppose there is technically a risk. What is the risk in terms of, I think that there's a greater risk for us with our voters to say we're just going to build the 6 lane because that's what it said and we want to do it. There is a greater risk to do that than to do what our residents need and what that area of town. I drive down First all the time as well. And it does need to be modernized, but putting a 6 lane segment in between a couple of 4 lanes doesn't even make sense. And I don't know who proposed it back 20 years ago. I'm sure there was a good reason, but today there just isn't. And I for one, think that we need to show wisdom here, and we need to continue to demonstrate our commitment to the community in the decisions that we make and the proposals that we make for wise investment of their dollars. These are their dollars. And so whatever we need to do to figure out how to do that, that would be my suggestion. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. And without belaboring that, I think the reason for this exercise is exactly everything you just outlined, because no one wants to be wasting public dollars. But there is a fundamental piece, which I keep coming back to, and that is the delivery of the program that resonates with the voters so that we can have a little more robust conversation down the road. And I think that's the fundamental piece to this. And I think the risk is minimized by going out and having dialogue. So I wanted to go back to the slides, Jim, that you had. There was one thing in there, as usual, I tend to read them, so I apologize for that.
If I
It's
could
the-
figure out how to
I think
get back
it's-
to the
I think it's
slides.
the third,
Okay.
second from the last or third from the last slide that you had. I just wanted to point something out. You know,
And Mr. Chair, I would ask that is this on the presentation 5 or presentation?
It was on I was on the one that right before these, it was on item 5. I'll just tell you what it was. In your language, and again, I want to just read it for you, but you had mentioned that there was an ineligible element or increase in scope or some language
Okay.
that it was up to the jurisdiction to recommend funding, something like that, or
Right.
identify funding. Good with that. My recommendation across the board will be an RTA expense. So that's a nuance there, right? Because I think the intent of your note was that we would identify non-RTA funding or some other source, right? And that's a potential issue for us down the road. And I just wanted to put that out there. Let's see here.
Would probably be the final bullet.
Suspensions. Right, scope change, the lead agency. No, I think it was the one that you said specific, maybe it was previous slide, maybe. No, next one. It was in one of these, you said that the agency identifies the funding or talks about the funding for the expanded scope and the eligibility. I go back to, I understand that, but we have to be careful that we don't confuse eligibility under the ballot language in that conversation with delivery of the program. And I think it's important that we have that discussion up front so that.
But I think that goes back to not this slide, but the next slide, which we're talking about expansion. So in cases like that, where there's expansion, according to the statutes, RTA dollars cannot be spent on those expansions. So that's really the intent of that.
I'm
This
clear.
is- This
I'm
is,
clear.
this is according to
To the
states,
RTA statute.
the RTA statute, not the ballot
No.
language.
Or
Statute.
and
The
not
statutes.
not the code.
So it's a expenditure authorization by the voters. And if the scope says 3 lanes, and now we want to go to 4 lanes, that's fine, that's allowed. But according to the statutes, the RTA cannot spend dollars for that increased cost.
What is can you send us the link to the statute? Okay.
I think the point is that expansion implies value to somehow to the agency or to the entity versus what's the process for it. Let's have a conversation around that. Because it doesn't make sense, just like going back to building 6 lanes along with 4 lanes. It doesn't make sense to build 3 lanes, if 6 lanes is what's warranted. That's what we do. So again, I'm not suggesting that it has to be the RTA by itself, but I think that that's part of the relationship and discussion here. So, and I think you had a question, Bill.
I do. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I think it would be very helpful for us to understand actually what the statute says, because I know we went through this with Broadway when we actually went from 8 lanes down to 6 lanes. And so from my understanding, the way the statute reads, it's substantial changes to the scope. And I think that that can go either way, whether it's up, because again, it's making sure the intent of delivering the project based on what the community input is, whether it goes up or down, those should be dollars that can be covered through the RTA initiative. So I think understanding that ballot language would be really important.
Yes, and I agree with that. But really, the specific point here is increase in incremental cost of the scope of the project. And so that's different than Broadway. Broadway was actually a reduction.
But so is First Avenue. I mean, this
First
is
Avenue is not an expansion.
not, but it's the same thing. But if we had to go the other way, because that's what the data showed, that should be something
So that's a
we,
good example. If it was
Correct.
proposed to go from 6 lanes to 8 lanes, then yes, that incremental cost according to the statutes, RTA could not spend dollars
well,
on that.
I'm not sure I 100% agree with that. I think that's where a great conversation would happen. I think that we need to really understand what that statute means, because it's not specific to an increase or in the project. It's specific to a substantial change. And that's really not defined. And I think that's where the conversation is.
Yeah, no,
That's the risk assessment.
Correct. And I think that's where we need to
we'll
go.
be happy to highlight that specific language. And
Okay, thank you.
And again, goes back to what Jim was saying, particularly related to this project. We've been having that conversation for years, trying to identify non-RTA dollars to be able to accommodate that. I can give you another example. Town of Marana did an expansion, and they were able to come up with additional funding that was non-RTA dollars to do the expansion. And that was related to that provision.
I think it'd be great to bring it back for a conversation.
Of course.
Thank you.
Chairman, my comment is relative to the reduction of the First Avenue project north of River. And the county suggestion that those funds be then transferred over to the expansion of Silver Bell. This kind of ties into this conversation we're having right now. I'd rather see it go to their 88 to $131 million shortfall as opposed to an expansion of something that's not in the original plan. I think that really needs to be looked at. Probably that's the board's decision, not ours.
Good thought. Other questions or comments?
Yeah, Mr. Chair, if I may.
Go ahead, Carmen.
Sure. I think this conversation highlights the need to be holistic in how we view it. And there's a lot of moving parts and pieces. The frequency of these conversations is accelerating, and I think that's a good thing. And I think to your point, Mr. Chair, about not only using the annual funding process to review these challenges and opportunities, the more that we can have these conversations and look at the entirety of need as well as the various sources of funding availability, then we're going to be better positioned to land on the right decisions. And I think that that is an important component. And to the extent that we can leverage the subcommittee infrastructure, or structure that we have in place, whether that be the TIP subcommittee or, other various entities, that I think would be beneficial so that these conversations can happen in robust detail, and those choices or the options, the full range of options available can be considered and then decided upon. That would benefit us all. So we're all in this. My apologies. We're all in this for the same purpose, and that's to wisely invest and utilize the funding resources we have for the greatest benefit to the community in terms of our transportation infrastructure. We'll get there if we can step back and look at these things in more of a complete view.
Mr. Chairman, one last comment.
Please.
Thank you. I appreciate, Bill, what you said. And one thing I think that we also need to keep in mind is fairness and consistency, so that we are in fact looking at things, similarly. Now, obviously the First Avenue reduction in scope, all that kind of stuff. I appreciate, Diana, what you mentioned as well. But, let's at least, and maybe Farhad, when you bring forward the statute, if you've got a handful of examples as to how it was applied, let's just say over the past 5 years, like don't go back too far. and how, just so we have that information, I think that's important for us to know. If, you know, some communities have stepped up this way and others not, then I just think we need to have that in our minds and consider exactly what was mentioned about, well, we're gonna need more dollars for this because we have a shortfall anyway. So thank you for that, Mr. Chairman.
When's our next meeting?
I don't believe we have one scheduled yet, but January, what's the date?
Yeah, so, but in January?
January 12th, I believe.
Probably be a good idea to have this discussion again
Yeah.
and really, you know, try to hone in on, because this is an important conversation. And I think back to Carmine's point and Bill's point, I mean, it's the holistic package, right? It's delivery of the package. And that's what, how does it other questions? I'd suggest we get it back, whatever the next meeting is.
Yeah.
Any questions or comments from anyone? Once? Twice? All right, without further commentary, I think adjournment is next. We will stay adjourned. We're gonna have to vote. If you guys want to vote on it, have at it. I gotta run, so.
All right, thank you.
Guys. Thank you.
Thank you.
So, I gotta run.